Alright guys, welcome back for another video on HAIKYU Fly High, and today I'm going to do a comparison between the best Libero in this game. Now, it's obviously going to be between Komori and also SP Nishnoya because they both have essentially SP equivalent stats, which are so much higher than the next best Libero, which are all SSR rarity right now. So as a result, they obviously are going to claim the number 1 and number 2 slot in terms of Libero. But in terms of which one is going to be better in which situation, that's what this video is going to be about, okay? Now, I'm not actually going to go into too much depth about their individual skill by skill. If you actually want to know or understand a bit more about Komori's kit, I already created a video on my channel, so you guys can check that out. But today's video is more kind of just talking about what are going to be the main difference between the two, and also in what situation is one going to be better than the other, okay? Now, there's also something else that I also want to say, which is that SP Nishnoya basically had a buff on the JP server, I think like a month ago. Before that buff that Nishnoya had, basically it was so much worse than Komori. However, now that they have actually updated the kit for Nishnoya, they essentially made Nishnoya quite different to before, and also very distinctly different role to the one Komori normally plays. And that's kind of why today, for the comparison purposes, I'm only going to compare between the Komori's kit and also the upgraded or already updated version of SP Nishnoya's kit, okay? Now, the way I'm going to do this comparison is that I have split off their main characteristic down into 3 sections, which is going to be the receive, their setting, and also any team buff that they will be able to provide. And you can probably already tell from this right now, just in terms of how much wording they have under each section, it's already going to be quite clear which character is going to be better at which sections. But let's still just go through them one by one, okay? So let's start off with the receive, which is kind of the bread and butter for any kind of liberals. On Komori, he's able to provide up to 50% buff to his reflex, and also up to 30% buff from his to his own receive, okay? So that's pretty much it, right? It's not nothing complex. That's like literally the only thing he's able to provide to his own receive. However, if we then switch over to Nishinoya, what we can see is that he's also able to apply some kind of stats buff. There's going to be a 20% receive, 40% reflect, which is going to be slightly lower than Komori, to be honest. However, one thing that he does have, which Komori doesn't, is that he can actually provide up to 85% spirit buff to himself as well. And that already can tell you the difference, and he is actually going to receive with much higher numerical number than what Komori is able to provide, okay? On top of that, he is also able to reduce his own cooldown for his ultimate attack whenever either your team, or if you actually have him as skill resistance, also when the opponent team members actually do a crit. So he can actually essentially spam his ultimate attack because his cooldown will keep on getting reduced, and that's going to be even more obvious as skill resistance 2 because the cap for his cooldown is actually going to reduce by 5, and that essentially can mean Nishnoya can pretty much do his ultimate receive every single turn, okay? And that's basically going to be the main difference between the two, because Komori, to be honest, still have a very long cooldown for his ultimate attack. Now, on top of that, there's also going to be some other additional benefit, which is that he can also get extra buff to his receive when he's actually receiving a power spot. This is a skill resistance 6, and also he can also reduce the cooldown for the spiker as well, for the person who's about to do a spike next in that turn once he is at skill resistance 6 as well, okay? So not only he has arguably better receive stats because of the spirit buff that he's able to offer, he can spam it a lot more often. He also have additional utility aspect to his receive, which are all the things Komori is going to miss from his own receive, okay? Now let's move on to the next section, which is going to be the setting ability, because both liberals can now actually set as well, and they essentially can act as a secondary setter when your setter is out of their ultimate passing skill, okay? So for Komori, he can actually provide up to 80% buff in his setting stat. This is actually higher than what he can provide in terms of his receive, which is absolutely crazy. He can also, when he do that receive, when he does that set, he can also increase the spiking, so the spiker who's about to spike after his setting by 15% awareness, also increase the morale. And furthermore, if you actually have him as skill resistance 2, he can actually reset his own setting cooldown as well, okay? So unlike Nishnoya, who will be keep on spamming his receive, Komori can keep on spamming his set, okay? Whereas if we then switch over to SP Nishnoya, his set is actually going to be a lot more basic, which is just that he's able to increase his awareness based on how much reflex stats he have. So basically, he can almost always, well, not always, but quite regularly crit if he do happen to set. And also when he's set, he can actually reduce the cooldown for your setter setting ability as well. Okay, and this can already kind of tell you the main difference between the two. Okay, Nishinoya is obviously going to be a lot more focused on receive, whereas Komori actually have a much better improvement in terms of setting stat. And on top of that, Komori is also able to provide crazy amount of team buff, which SP Nishinoya is not able to provide anything at all, okay? That's kind of why SP Nishinoya doesn't even have any section for the team buff. But what Komori is able to provide is that he can provide defense technique, he can provide receive to your teammates, but only if it's not an ultimate receive, okay? So if it's an ultimate skill, which happens to be received, then he won't be able to improve that. However, if it's more like a skill 2 or skill 3 that's happened to be received, then he can actually improve that. And this is actually 70% as well. Okay, that's actually higher than the receive he can provide to himself. He can also increase the power or quick spike and also attack technique for the spiker, and he can also increase the strength as well by equivalent to the reflex stats as skill resistance 6. Okay, so if you literally just look at how much buff he's able to provide and the fact that they literally cover every single stats out there available, okay, you can already know that Komori is actually insanely good as a buffer, whereas Nishinoya doesn't have any buffing ability at all. Okay, now you guys can probably already tell the main difference now between the two characters. So in what situation is one going to be better than another? Okay, you might be just thinking, if I want buffer, then I'll go for Komori. If I don't want any buff, then I don't go for Komori. I'll go for an SP Nishinoya, which is fair. But then you have to think about in what situation would you not actually want a buff, right? A buff is always going to be good. So you really shouldn't really be considering the difference between the two or how you want to play them based on buffing. The main thing you actually really want to care about is actually going to be receiving and setting mechanics, because I kind of already mentioned one thing which is going to be quite crucial here. SP Nishinoya can keep on spamming his receive, okay? Whereas Komori is not able to reduce the cooldown for his receive. However, instead, he can first of all increase your teammates' non-ultimate receive, and also he can potentially spam his own setting ability instead, okay? And what this already means is that if you actually play a team with SP Nishnoya, very likely 80-90% of all the receive are going to be covered by SP Nishnoya. And what that essentially allows you to do is actually free up the rest of your team to not have any receiving ability, because you don't need other characters to be able to receive. SP Nishnoya will be doing all of the receiving for you, okay? And that essentially already means one major thing that you're able to do in terms of your team building, because SP Nishnoya is basically going to be very good, not for receiving team, but more for teams which actually lack receivers. Whereas for Komori, it's obviously the complete opposite. He actually buff a lot more when you have teammates who have a receive but does not ultimate. So we're more looking at the likes of, let's say, Sakusa, SP Hinata, who have their receiving skill as their skill 2. This way, Komori is not actually going to then be able to actually steal their receive from those characters, and in fact a lot of those characters actually want to receive themselves, okay? For example, Sakusa actually want to receive himself in order to trigger his skill 2. And if you actually end up playing Sakusa alongside with SP Nishnoya, Sakusa is never going to be able to trigger his ability, which is like one of the worst things possible. So that's kind of what, depending on your teammate and whether or not you actually want them to receive, or whether or not they can even be good at receiving, that can really tell you a lot in terms of which Libero is going to be better for that situation. And that's from the receiving point of view. It's also going to be similar from setting point of view, because once you can see one thing Komori is able to provide is the fact that he can actually spam his setting, assuming as skill resistance 2 obviously, and also he can provide a lot of buff, and also his set itself is actually very strong. It's arguably even stronger than his receive. Whereas for Nishnoya, it's a lot more basic. However, it's actually able to reduce the cooldown for your setters. And all of a sudden, you don't realize that, for example, if I play in a team with multiple setters, which can actually happen once position limit update is here, if I already have 2 setters on my field, Do I still need my Libero to do my setting for me? In those cases, probably not. Then SP Nishnoya is actually going to be better because first of all, he's not going to try to steal the set, and if he do actually set, he will actually be reduced the cooldown for both of my other setters as well. Okay, whereas let's say if you're only going to play with single setter, then in those cases, Komori may actually be a bit better because Komori can actually step in and help with all of the passing when your setter is out of their ultimate skill. Okay, so once again, you kind of need to evaluate your team in terms of what other characters you're going to have in order to determine whether you actually need someone to receive a bit more or to actually set a bit more. Okay, but overall, what I'm going to say is that both characters are absolutely terrific. They're both, the number one, number two Libero in this game, hands down. They are equally as strong, but it's going to be more down to kind of the teammates that you're going to have in terms of which one is going to be slightly better suited in terms of a team building. Okay, hopefully this video clears up any confusion you guys may have between the two characters. Let me know what you guys think and also which one you're going to go for, or maybe both of them.